You can sit with the teens. Adults are at that table, my mom snapped, tossing me a plastic spoon. My AUT laughed. Just be grateful we let you attend this time. I ate in silence. Near the end, the event coordinator approached and announced, "Hey, you're covering the $3,400 balance, right?" I smiled, pointed to the head table, and declared, "Ask the adults." I, 29M, walked into the restaurant for my cousin's engagement party, expecting the usual family chaos, but not quite prepared for what was about to unfold. The venue was one of those upscale places with dim lighting and cloth napkins, the kind my family only visited for special occasions. My mom spotted me immediately and waved me over with that forced smile she reserved for public appearances. She handed me a plastic spoon while everyone else had proper silverware. I stared at it for a moment, the cheap white plastic stark against the elegant table settings around us. My mom gestured toward a smaller table near the kitchen where my teenage cousins were sitting, their phones out and looking bored. The adults were seated at the main table closer to the happy couple, complete with wine glasses and appetizers already served. My mom informed me that I would be sitting with the teens since the adult table was full. I looked around and counted at least 3 empty chairs at the main table, but I didn't argue. Not yet. My aunt chimed in with a laugh, telling me to just be grateful they let me attend this time. The reference stung because 6 months ago, they had uninvited me from my own grandmother's birthday party over some ridiculous family drama that wasn't even my fault. I made my way to the teen table and squeezed into a chair between my 16-year-old cousin who was deep into TikTok and another who was texting furiously. They barely acknowledged my presence, which was fine by me. I had bigger things on my mind anyway. The plastic spoon felt ridiculous as I attempted to eat the salad course, but I managed. What my family didn't know was that 3 weeks ago, my cousin had called me in a panic. The original venue had fallen through, and the deposit was lost. The backup location required full payment up front, and they were short on funds. My cousin had begged me to help, promising they would pay me back after the wedding gifts came in. Against my better judgment, I had transferred $3,400 to secure the venue. I watched from my exile table as my family laughed and toasted at the adult table. My mom was holding court, telling some story that had everyone in stitches. My aunt was showing off photos on her phone, probably of her latest vacation. My uncle was working his way through his second bottle of wine. None of them had contributed a single dollar to this event, yet here they were, treating me like I was still 12 years old. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had paid for their fancy evening, and they couldn't even give me proper silverware or a decent seat. I ate my meal in silence, watching the dynamics play out. My cousin's fiancé kept glancing over at me apologetically, clearly uncomfortable with how I was being treated. My cousin herself seemed oblivious, caught up in the excitement of being the center of attention. The appetizers came and went. The main course was served. I received the same food as everyone else, just delivered to the kids' table like some afterthought. The teenagers around me were actually decent company once they warmed up, complaining about school and sharing gossip about family members. At least someone was treating me like a human being. As dessert was being cleared, I noticed the event coordinator making rounds to different tables, checking on things and ensuring everyone was satisfied. She was a professional woman in her 40s, clipboard in hand, managing the evening with practiced efficiency. She had been the one who processed my payment weeks ago, though my family had no idea about that detail. The coordinator approached our table first, asking the teens if they had enjoyed their evening. They nodded politely and thanked her for the great food. Then she moved toward the adult table, but stopped and turned back to me specifically. My heart rate picked up because I knew what was coming. She asked me directly if I was ready to settle the remaining balance. The entire restaurant seemed to go quiet, though that was probably just my imagination. The teens at my table looked confused, not understanding what balance she was referring to. The adult table was still chatting loudly, unaware of the conversation happening just a few feet away. I smiled and stood up slowly, making sure my voice would carry across the room. I told her loudly that she should ask the adults at that table, pointing directly toward my family. The coordinator looked confused and asked me to clarify what I meant. I explained, still speaking loud enough for everyone to hear, that since the adults didn't think I belonged at their table, they could handle the adult responsibilities too. The room actually did go quiet this time. My mom's face went pale as she realized what was happening. My aunt's mouth dropped open mid-sentence. The coordinator walked over to their table and politely explained that there was still a balance of $3,400 that needed to be settled before the evening could conclude. My cousin finally looked over at me with panic in her eyes. She had clearly never told anyone about my payment arrangement, probably hoping to keep it secret until after they could pay me back. Now the secret was out, and the family was learning in the most public way possible that their despised family member had been bankrolling their elegant evening. My mom stammered something about not understanding what balance the coordinator was referring to. The coordinator patiently explained that the venue required full payment and that I had covered the deposit and most of the cost, but there was still an outstanding amount due before they could close out the event. My uncle, always quick with his wallet when it came to impressing people, reached for his credit card. But then he stopped and looked at the coordinator with confusion. He asked exactly how much had already been paid and by whom. When she confirmed that I had covered the majority of the costs weeks ago, the entire table turned to stare at me. I remained standing, enjoying the moment more than I probably should have. My cousin's fiancé was shaking his head, clearly embarrassed by the whole situation. My cousin looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. The other guests at nearby tables were starting to notice the commotion. My aunt, never one to back down from confrontation, demanded to know why I hadn't mentioned paying for the venue. I looked her straight in the eye and reminded her that adults were supposed to handle adult conversations at the adult table. Since I had been relegated to the children's section, I figured the children's table wasn't the appropriate place for discussing financial matters. The coordinator was getting uncomfortable with the family drama unfolding in her venue. She politely but firmly reminded everyone that the balance needed to be settled so her staff could finish closing out the event. Other families were waiting for the room, and they were already running behind schedule. My mom finally found her voice and asked me how much I had actually paid. When I told her the full amount, including the lost deposit at the original venue that I had also covered, her face went white. The total was closer to $5,000 when everything was added up. Money I had worked overtime for months to save. The silence stretched out awkwardly. None of them had that kind of cash readily available, especially not on a random Tuesday night. My uncle's credit card might cover it, but the damage to family dynamics was already done. Everyone now knew that the family member they had been treating like garbage all evening was the reason they had been able to celebrate in the first place. My cousin finally spoke up, admitting to everyone that she had asked for my help when their original plans fell through. She apologized for not telling the family earlier, but said she had been embarrassed about needing financial assistance. Her fiancé added that they had planned to announce their appreciation for my help during the toasts, but clearly that plan had gone out the window. I looked around the table at my family members, all of whom were avoiding eye contact now. The same people who had been laughing and enjoying themselves just minutes earlier were now sitting in uncomfortable silence. The teens at my table were watching the drama unfold with wide eyes, probably getting more entertainment than they had expected from a family dinner. The coordinator cleared her throat and reminded us again about the balance. My uncle finally stepped up and handed over his credit card, muttering something about dealing with family finances later. As she walked away to process the payment, the room remained tense. My mom attempted to smooth things over by saying they had no idea I had helped with the venue costs. She suggested we could all sit together and work out the payment details as a family. I almost laughed at the irony. Now that they needed something from me, suddenly I was welcome at the adult table. I told her that wouldn't be necessary. The event was paid for, my cousin was happy, and that was what mattered. But I also made it clear that this would be the last time I covered expenses for family events where I wasn't treated as an equal member of the family. The message was received loud and clear. Update 1. The following morning, my phone started buzzing with calls and texts from various family members. My mom wanted to have lunch to discuss what happened. My aunt sent a long message about family unity and understanding. Even my uncle, who rarely initiated contact, called to talk about the previous evening. I ignored most of the messages initially. I had said what I needed to say at the restaurant, and I wasn't interested in rehashing the drama immediately. But my cousin's text was different. She asked if we could meet for coffee, just the two of us, to talk about everything that had happened. We met that afternoon at a small cafe near her apartment. She looked exhausted and apologetic as she sat down across from me. She started by thanking me again for helping with the venue, acknowledging that without my contribution, there would have been no engagement party at all. Then she apologized for how the family had treated me the night before. What surprised me was her next admission. She told me that she had specifically asked my mom to make sure I was seated at the main table, given that I was helping to pay for the event. My mom had apparently dismissed the request, saying that seating arrangements were her responsibility and that I would be fine wherever I was placed. This revelation changed everything for me. It meant my treatment the previous evening wasn't just thoughtless family dynamics or an oversight. It was deliberate exclusion despite my cousin's specific request to include me properly. My mom had known about my financial contribution and chose to humiliate me anyway. My cousin went on to explain that several family members had been asking her for months about contributing to wedding expenses. Everyone had excuses about tight budgets or other financial obligations. When the venue crisis happened, I was the only person who stepped up without hesitation or conditions. Yet somehow I was the one being treated like an outsider. She handed me an envelope containing a check for the full amount I had paid, explaining that her fiancé's family had heard about what happened and insisted on covering all the venue costs. They were appalled by how I had been treated and wanted to make sure I was repaid immediately. The gesture was unexpected and deeply appreciated. But the money wasn't really the point anymore. The previous evening had clarified something important about family dynamics that I had been ignoring for years. This wasn't the first time I had been excluded or treated poorly at family events. It was just the first time the hypocrisy had been so publicly exposed. Update 2. Word about the restaurant incident spread through our extended family network faster than I anticipated. By the end of the week, I was receiving calls from relatives I hadn't spoken to in months, all wanting to hear my version of events. The story had apparently grown in the telling, with some versions making it sound like I had caused a massive scene. My grandmother called on Saturday morning, confused by conflicting reports she had received. I gave her the straightforward facts about what happened, including the background about paying for the venue. Her response surprised me. She said she wasn't shocked by my family's behavior, but she was disappointed that it had taken this long for me to stand up for myself. She went on to share stories about similar dynamics she had observed over the years, instances where I had been excluded or treated differently that I hadn't even realized she had noticed. According to her, several family members had grown comfortable taking advantage of my generally easygoing nature and my reluctance to create conflict. The conversation with my grandmother was enlightening, but also frustrating. If these patterns had been obvious to her for years, why hadn't anyone addressed them earlier? She explained that family dynamics were complicated, and people often chose the path of least resistance rather than confronting uncomfortable truths. My mom finally cornered me at the grocery store on Sunday afternoon. She had apparently been trying to reach me all weekend without success. The conversation started with her expressing hurt that I had embarrassed the family in public. She felt there had been better ways to handle the situation that wouldn't have created such drama. I listened to her concerns and then asked her directly about my cousin's request to seat me at the main table. The question caught her off guard, and I could see in her expression that she knew exactly what I was referring to. After a long pause, she admitted that she had received the request but decided against it because she thought it would upset the established seating arrangements. When I pressed her on what those arrangements were based on, she became defensive. She claimed that family seating was traditionally organized by age and relationship proximity, which would naturally place me with the younger relatives. I pointed out that I was older than two of the people seated at the adult table and more closely related to the guests of honor than several others who had been given prominent seats. The real issue became clear when she finally admitted that she hadn't wanted me to feel uncomfortable at the main table given recent family tensions. She was referring to disagreements we had had over the past year about various family decisions and my tendency to voice opinions that didn't align with the majority view. In other words, I was being excluded not because of age or relationship status, but because my family found it easier to marginalize me than to deal with my perspectives. The plastic spoon and children's table weren't accidents or oversights. They were deliberate signals about my place in the family hierarchy. Update 3. The aftermath of the engagement party incident continued to ripple through family relationships over the following weeks. My cousin's wedding planning became a source of tension as various family members attempted to assert their opinions about guest lists, seating arrangements, and financial responsibilities. I found myself in the unexpected position of being consulted about decisions, probably because everyone now knew I had the ability to contribute financially when needed. My aunt, who had laughed about being grateful I was allowed to attend, called to apologize 3 weeks after the incident. The apology felt performative rather than genuine, focused more on maintaining family harmony than acknowledging the hurt her words had caused. She suggested that we all needed to move past the misunderstanding and focus on supporting my cousin's upcoming wedding. I told her that I appreciated the call, but that moving forward would require changes in how family interactions were handled. I wasn't interested in pretending the incident hadn't happened or accepting that my treatment had been a simple misunderstanding. The patterns of exclusion and dismissal were too consistent to be accidental. The conversation revealed another layer of family dynamics I hadn't fully recognized before. My aunt admitted that some family members had been concerned about my financial situation over the past few years. They had assumed that my reluctance to participate in certain expensive family activities meant I was struggling financially and had been trying to protect me from embarrassment. This revelation was both insulting and illuminating. Rather than simply asking about my circumstances or preferences, they had made assumptions and acted on them without my input. The result was exclusion disguised as protection, marginalization presented as consideration for my feelings. I explained that my selective participation in family events had nothing to do with financial limitations and everything to do with not wanting to waste money on activities I didn't enjoy or people who didn't seem to value my presence. The engagement party had been an exception because I genuinely cared about my cousin and wanted to support her happiness. My uncle, who had ultimately paid the restaurant balance, reached out the following month with a different kind of conversation. He acknowledged that family dynamics had become complicated over the years and suggested that everyone bore some responsibility for allowing negative patterns to develop. He proposed organizing a family meeting to address ongoing issues and establish better communication going forward. The suggestion had merit, but I was skeptical about whether real change was possible. Family meetings in our history had typically been exercises in conflict avoidance rather than genuine problem solving. People would make temporary adjustments to keep peace, but underlying attitudes and behaviors remained unchanged. I agreed to participate in the meeting with specific conditions. Everyone needed to acknowledge their role in creating the current situation rather than treating it as a mutual misunderstanding. There needed to be concrete commitments to change specific behaviors rather than vague promises to do better. And there needed to be consequences for future violations of whatever agreements were reached. The meeting happened 6 weeks after the engagement party, held at my grandmother's house with her serving as moderator. The conversation was uncomfortable but necessary, with each family member explaining their perspective on recent events and acknowledging their contributions to ongoing problems. What emerged was a picture of family relationships that had gradually deteriorated over years of poor communication, unspoken resentments, and competing expectations. Everyone had grievances, but most had been addressing them through passive-aggressive behavior rather than direct conversation. My mom admitted that she had been treating me differently because she felt I had become too critical of family decisions over the past few years. My aunt acknowledged that her jokes and comments had been hurtful rather than playful. My uncle recognized that his tendency to avoid conflict had enabled problems to grow worse over time. For my part, I acknowledged that my withdrawal from family activities had probably contributed to my marginalization. When people don't see you as actively choosing to participate, it becomes easier to exclude you from decisions and planning. My tendency to avoid confrontation had allowed disrespectful treatment to continue unchallenged. The family meeting resulted in specific agreements about future interactions. Family event planning would involve input from all adult family members regardless of their financial contributions. Seating arrangements and invitation decisions would be discussed openly rather than decided unilaterally. Financial contributions would be acknowledged appropriately without creating obligations or expectations. Most importantly, we agreed that concerns about family member behavior or participation would be addressed directly rather than through exclusion or passive-aggressive treatment. If someone had an issue with my opinions or attitude, they needed to discuss it with me rather than punishing me through social isolation. The changes weren't immediate or perfect, but they were noticeable. My cousin's wedding 3 months later included me in the planning process from the beginning. I was seated appropriately and treated with respect throughout the celebration. The plastic spoon incident had become a family reference point for how not to handle conflicts and differences of opinion. The revenge element of my response to the engagement party situation had been satisfying in the moment, but the long-term value came from forcing conversations that should have happened years earlier. Sometimes public embarrassment is the only thing that motivates people to examine their behavior and make real changes. Looking back, I realized that accepting poor treatment without protest had been enabling the behavior to continue. My family needed to understand that respect and inclusion weren't optional extras in family relationships, but basic requirements. The restaurant incident had been dramatic, but it had accomplished something that years of private conversations had failed to achieve. The engagement party became a turning point in family relationships, not because of the money or the public confrontation, but because it finally made everyone acknowledge patterns of behavior that had been damaging family bonds for years. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for family members is refuse to accept their worst impulses and force them to do better.